Born in New York, sweet childhood memories of butterflies at a Swiss resort, an Oxford education, then many years as a foreign correspondent in difficult places at difficult times. Essays, memoir, fiction, Wings of a Kite Hawk, Heaven and Earth, Another Country, and a Walkley Award. But Nicolas Rothwell's signature journalism holds a very steady focus on the Australian desert and those who live it. And today, an exploration, the idea of fragments, fragments in literary forms, fragments in nature. May I introduce Nicolas Rothwell.
Thanks very much, Hannah. On the whole, I'm an opponent of the biographical theory of writing, and I don't think that facts about the writer of a book really get you to the heart of the book. If it's really good, it takes on its own flow and its own swing. So while I say that, I'm rather conscious that in what I'm about to read to you, I do dwell from time to time on personal experiences, but I think the essence of what I'm trying to do is to abstract from those experiences, to pulverize them and make them into something else. So what I've tried to do is provide a kind of running commentary on the last couple of years of my life when I was attempting to make sense of some experiences which I'd had in foreign corresponding in the Middle East, and to see where I'd actually brought myself to or got to while writing and while composing. I also have the sense that there's not really much point in coming to a writers' festival and uncloaking yourself in front of people if you don't have something new to say. And the majority of writers' festivals, obviously, are pretty pro forma events where you're just advancing the interests of your latest book and hoping for a good outcome in terms of sales or whatever. And I've come to find those events really pretty awful and purgatorial. And so it seemed to me that the only way that you can both protect yourself as a writer from that horror and give something real and true to the people who are kind enough to come and listen to you is to attempt to crystallize and formulate some new advance. There's just no point on otherwise. And that is what I've tried to do in this little account of where I'm up to. It's a sort of progress report, so I'm very grateful to you for coming to listen to it, and grateful to the organisers of the festival for being so kind as to ask me. During the year or so I spent recently as a correspondent in Iraq and the wider Middle East, I found myself often in the vicinity of holy places. Temples from the Hellenistic era, early churches, Umayyad mosques and desert sanctuaries, mosaic-floored synagogues. I visited many of those sites, most of them ruins, and almost always they seemed to me not merely damaged, but somehow breached, stripped of their power, devastated. And this was not just because they had suffered from the effects of bombardment and sacrilege, or because they had been decaying for so many years. That pulverized, broken quality was also the result of changes in the human realm. The men and women who had believed in those places had vanished, and faith, much like love, once shattered, cannot be resumed. The aura of a sacred precinct cannot endure man's neglect. Its air of holiness remains only as a reproachful, nostalgic afterglow. And against such backdrops, the lessons and warnings of religious texts seem to flash into sharp, bitter focus and to take aim at gods as well as man. Thoughts of this kind would always come to me after I had driven the narrow, ill-maintained highway through the Syrian desert towards the Euphrates Valley, the Iraqi border, and Anbar province beyond. I used to break my journey round sunset at Tadmor, beside the ruins of Palmyra, Queen Zenobia's capital, home to the loveliest sculptures of the ancient world. Palmyra is much admired today for its mazy underground tombs, although it is presided over by the monumental, intricately decorated Temple of Bel, and its lonely archaeological museum is filled with masterworks of Palmyrene funerary art. Busts of the deceased, wearing wistful expressions, and often holding little flasks beside their eyelids to catch the falling tears. But sometimes I travelled into Iraq on a different road which passed through the southeastern provinces of Turkey, and then I could look out along the frontier as I drove and glimpse between the watchtowers in no man's land the tumbled battle site of Karkemish, or the mountain city of Mardin, which hides a honeycomb of catacombs and half-known Chaldean churches. And in that same region lies obscure, forgotten Sumatar, an astrological complex raised by the Sabaeans, whose religion was said to be the oldest and most cryptic of the entire Levant. There were times, too, when I took the shortcut through northern Syria past Aleppo, and once I even made a side trip to Deir Saman, the Basilica of St. Simeon the Stylite. It is a grand, wide-arched structure that looks out across a fertile plain. The remains of the column upon which the saint lived for 37 years are still there, and beside it, amidst the permanently blossoming wildflowers, is a Greek inscription, almost a graffito. "You are like the wind-swept dust," it reads. How not to hear the echo of God's sentence to Adam in the book of Genesis, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return into the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and into dust shalt thou return." This theme, this interest in dust and ash, in dustiness, is one of the leitmotifs of the Old Testament, and I have found it comes to mind frequently during my present travels through the sandy, dusty realms of northern and central Australia. When I left the Middle East, that sense of things falling to dust and fragments seemed very strong. I went back to my home in Darwin and started trying to forge my thoughts into a continuous narrative, a smooth stream of words. But soon I fell into composing in fragments. I would write nothing more than stray snatches of story, and it was not just that I was failing in my tasks, for what author is not always distorting and betraying the first image that forms in his mind's eye of his work? No, the fragment, the symbol-laden fragment, rather than the flowing sequence, was the necessary form for what I had to say. What I meant was in fragments and dust. It was best told in fragments. Fragments were all that I could manage, and even they seemed too controlled, too much a bid to reimpose order on a flux of shimmering, glancing, barely causal connecting chains. There are two quite separate thoughts or intuitions that come to me as I turn over these experiences. First, the idea that the religious tradition which shaped the West over the past 2 millennia is no longer intact, that it is broken, it has fallen from primacy, and if it lingers on, it does so only in a wounded way. Its hold is no longer total. A pathos hangs over it, much like the pathos we associate with ruins. And in a similar fashion, I feel the template of narrative that has dominated Western literature so long is not what it was. Order and form, which once provided the meridian, which were all in art, have lost their supremacy. They too have been dethroned. Is there a link between these two seeming deaths, the death of the divine and the demise of narrative? In what follows, in thinking about fragments and dust and fate, I would like to range across a wide landscape in an episodic way, to explore these twin themes in tandem, to draw together a set of scattered elements, to compose a tale from them. Let me begin with a book written under straitened circumstances in a city of multiple faiths, Istanbul, in wartime, between May 1942 and April 1945. Mimesis, or Mimesis, the German philologist Erich Auerbach's overview of Western literature, is also a manual for life, a self-portrait and a judgment on our age. As soon as it was published, it was recognized as a work of majesty. It figures on any serious list of the last century's great books. It is constantly praised to the stars. It certainly figured in my scapegrace classical education, which took place also very much at the close of a dying tradition. I remember vividly the sense of ending I used to feel as I watched my teachers pace the classrooms, waving their hands vainly in order to compel our attention to the austere texts beneath our eyes. Mimesis, in those days, as I recall, had a lavish purple cover and feathery baroque pattern on it, intended doubtless to suggest the highest reaches of refinement, and I know I glanced through it, but as so often in youth I paid little heed to what was there. Among other things, Auerbach expressed in his pages with great clarity the links between the narratives of art and life. He spoke of the interpretation and understanding of our existence, which arise from life itself, which grow up in the individuals themselves, which are to be discerned in their thoughts, their consciousness, and in a more concealed form in their words and actions, for there is always going on within us a process of formulation and interpretation whose subject matter is our own self. How much time and pain I would have saved had I been able then to internalize those words, but one of the great divisions of existence is that between people who absorb the learning that lies in books and those who take nothing on trust and have to find out the hard way through life's lessons for themselves. When I had finished my time in the Middle East, I took a flight out from Tehran to Istanbul, and during my brief stay there I found a copy of Mimesis, the 50th anniversary edition as it happens, in a second-hand bookshop in the Galata district. And I fell upon it in my hotel, for it had been more than a year since I had read a book, or even, I suppose, held one in my hands. This version had a large, disquieting Beckmann image on the cover, the central panel of a triptych, a heavy, symbol-laden painting showing a king's departure into exile. The text, though, I soon discovered to my bewilderment, was a fast-paced ride through literary time, and it paralleled in uncanny fashion my own loves and enthusiasms, which had been so hard won and painstakingly hunted down during my meanders through books and life. Auerbach's fondest, most intoxicating words were reserved for a small, distinctive set of authors. He admired Dante, he adored Racine and Saint-Simon. There were, though, some darker outliers. He paid special attention to Ammianus Marcellinus, the historian of the late Roman era, the canvas for whose history was the Middle Eastern region I had been roaming through over the previous tense 12 months. Ammianus is notorious for his overwrought, excessive style. I suffered in my youth through many of his most purple patches set by sadistic examiners, but his most striking characteristic is his unremittingly gloomy life view, and it was this clearly that spoke to Auerbach. Excuse me. Ammianus's world, he writes, is very often a caricature of the normal human environment in which we live. Very often it is like a bad dream. This is not simply because horrible things happen in it. Treason, torture, persecution, denunciations, such things are prevalent in almost all times and places. And the periods when life is tolerable are not too frequent. What makes Ammianus's world so oppressive is the lack of any sort of counterbalance. For if it is true that man is capable of everything horrible, it is also true that the horrible always engenders counterforces, and in most epochs of atrocious occurrences, the great vital forces of the human soul reveal themselves. Love and sacrifice, heroism in the service of conviction, and the ceaseless search for possibilities of a purer existence. Nothing of the sort is to be found in Ammianus. Striking only in the sensory, resigned and as it were paralyzed despite its stubborn rhetorical passion, his manner of writing history nowhere displays anything redeeming, nowhere anything that points to a better future. So, Auerbach, in prose of fervour, for he is describing, of course, his own Europe, the Europe from which he has been exiled. Mimesis goes on to chart its way through the story of the novel, its rise, the changes in its modes of representation, and its eventual triumph, before concluding on a discordant note. Auerbach considers the modern scene that summit of sophistication. He looks at Proust and Woolf and Ulysses. How could he fail to? He had begun 500 pages before with the Odyssey. This is his closing lament as he surveys the breakdown of the narrative tradition and the rise of an inward-looking literary consciousness. He links this tendency to the crisis of the West and to the tradition's lack of belief in itself. There is in all these works a certain atmosphere of universal doom. There is often something confusing, something hazy about them, something hostile to the reality which they represent. We not infrequently find a turning away from the practical will to live, or delight in portraying it under its most brutal forms. There is hatred of culture and civilization, brought out by means of the subtlest stylistic devices which culture and civilization have developed, and often a radical and fanatical urge to destroy. A dizzying, heart-stopping verdict. And perhaps over the course of the past half-century, which has been a period of return to order and prosperity in the nations of the West, and of a moderate stabilization in the world of narrative, Auerbach, had he lived, might well have been tempted to modify his view. But the broad, implacable sweep of his judgment remains. Mimesis is the book of the rise and the eclipse of the novel, that ultimate secular social form of story writing, and it closes at a point its author sees as that tale's trembling end. In his analysis, Auerbach was tracing several related threads, themes that he had picked out from the tapestry of time's flow. He was writing about the age of high culture and its transformation, first in the bourgeois era and then in the furnace of modernity. He was writing about the apogee of Christian civilization and its fiery, phantasmagoric European death. He was writing about mimesis, the representation of the world in words, and the evolution and the fate of that artistic skill. What do we see today if we take up these threads from our point of vantage, half a world distant? The clock has advanced. We live now in an age of mass culture. Literature has become a minority taste. Religious faith no longer preserves its former role as the unquestioned underpinning of our experience of life, as the shell of the broad, rich world. Belief may endure, and even in pockets spread, but the place of religion as part of the consensus of the West has evaporated, and so, to some degree, has the notion of the enlightened West itself. And representation? It survives in its new modes. The novel, that protean form, even thrives, especially here